Single dad let a runaway girl sleep in his diner, then her mother arrived with police. That night, as the cold rain hammered hard against the windows of a small roadside diner, a single father made a choice that could destroy everything he had carefully built. The girl was shaking, soaking wet, telling him she had nowhere left to go. He simply gave her a place to sleep. But just a few hours later, the front door burst open. Officers flooded in, and standing behind them was a powerful woman trembling with barely contained rage. He had no idea that his single act of kindness had just touched a secret the entire town had been protecting. What would you have done if a single act of kindness had put you face to face with the law? The diner sat at the edge of a two-lane highway like something the world had half forgotten, a squat building with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered, its orange glow catching the edge of the gravel lot each night, like a dim lighthouse for travelers who had nowhere better to be. The sign read Carter's, and it had read that for 3 years now, ever since Wyatt Carter packed up the remnants of a life that no longer existed in the city and rebuilt it here, on the margins, where nobody asked too many questions and nobody expected too many answers. Wyatt was 29 years old, though most mornings he felt older. He had the hands of a man who cooked for a living, calloused at the fingertips, scarred at the knuckle, never quite clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. He had worked in serious kitchens before this one, the kind with white tablecloths and wine lists thick as novels, the kind where executive chefs threw pans across stainless steel counters and considered it inspiration. He had been good at that world. Precise, fast, controlled under pressure. The kind of cook who could hold 6 simultaneous orders in his head and plate all of them cleanly. But after everything that had happened, he had needed something smaller, something he could hold in both hands. He did not like talking about why he had left. The few regulars who came in on weekday mornings knew not to press. They knew about the accident in broad strokes, the wet road, the negligent driver who had run a red light without ever slowing, the hospital room in which Wyatt had sat alone for 11 hours before a nurse came to find him. But they did not ask for details, and Wyatt did not offer them. What they saw instead was a man who cooked eggs perfectly, kept the coffee hot at all times, and smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes unless his daughter was nearby. Hannah Carter was 6 years old and entirely unfazed by the strangeness of growing up in a roadside diner. She did her homework in the corner booth every evening, spreading her worksheets across the laminate tabletop like she owned the place, because in every way that actually mattered, she did. She had her mother's quiet intensity and her father's habit of observing people before speaking to them. She noticed things. She noticed when a customer came in carrying grief behind their eyes. She noticed when her father had slept less than 4 hours. She noticed everything, and she tucked those observations away with a patience that seemed far too large for someone her size. The diner stayed open 24 hours, though the late stretch midnight to 5 in the morning was almost always empty. Truckers stopped sometimes, the occasional couple driving through after a concert. Now and then a drifter who counted coins before ordering, and Wyatt never made it difficult for them. He knew what it was like to need something without having quite enough to ask for it properly. On a normal night, the rhythm of the place was almost meditative. The hum of the refrigeration unit behind the counter, the sound of rain on the flat roof when it came, the old radio that played whatever happened to be on, because changing it would mean admitting you cared. That October night, the rain had arrived in hard and fast, the way it sometimes did in that part of the state, sideways, cold-edged, insistent. Hannah had fallen asleep in the corner booth around 9, her spelling worksheet still half-finished beneath her cheek. Wyatt had draped a blanket over her and gone back to wiping down the counter, listening to the rain, thinking about nothing in particular. He was not the kind of man who expected things anymore. Life had cured him of that particular habit. The door opened at 11:47. Wyatt heard it. Before he saw her, the heavy groan of the door swinging inward, followed by the cold, wet rush of air that slapped the floor tiles just inside the entrance. He turned from the counter, and there she was, a girl, maybe 14 or 15 years old, standing in the doorway with water streaming from her hair and clothes. one arm wrapped around herself, the other hand still pressed flat against the door, as if she hadn't quite decided whether to walk forward or step back into the rain. She was not dressed for the weather. A thin zip jacket over a dark shirt, jeans soaked through to the knee, sneakers that squelched when she finally stepped inside and let the door fall shut behind her. She looked at Wyatt for exactly 1 second, then looked away, her eyes moving across the diner in the quick, systematic way of someone checking every exit in a room. Wyatt had seen that look before. Not often, but enough. "Take a seat," he said, keeping his voice neutral, the voice you use with a spooked animal you don't want to frighten further. She moved to a stool at the counter and sat down carefully, as if she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed. Her hands pressed flat against the laminate, and they were not steady. She was somewhere between freezing cold and deeply frightened, and Wyatt could not immediately tell which was doing more damage. "What can I get you?" he asked. "Just water," she said, "if that's okay." The words came out small and cautious, braced against the possibility that it wasn't okay. Wyatt set a glass of water in front of her without comment, and went back to straightening condiments, giving her the space of not being watched. That was something he had understood for a long time. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a person was look away. She had no phone. He had noticed this when she set her hands on the counter. Nothing, no device, no bag, nothing to suggest she had come equipped for any version of tonight. She didn't reach for the menu. She didn't order food. She just held the glass and looked at the water in it like it was the most complicated thing she'd encountered in hours. Her name, though Wyatt didn't know it yet, was Sophia Blake. She was 15 years old, and she had been walking for nearly 2 hours before the lights of Carter's diner had appeared through the rain. She had chosen it because the lights were on. At that hour, and in that part of the county, lights still burning meant someone was still willing to be present, and that was the only qualification she had the bandwidth to evaluate. She watched the man behind the counter from the edge of her vision. She had learned that assessing people without looking at them directly, because looking directly had a way of making people feel entitled to look back. But this man was not monitoring her in the way she had anticipated. He moved around the counter doing ordinary things, refilling a sugar dispenser, washing a mug. He did not make a performance of not watching her, which would have been its own kind of pressure. He simply was not watching. That was unusual enough to be notable. In the corner booth, a small girl slept under a fleece blanket, her hair spread across a spelling worksheet, a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The sight of it made something tighten in Sophia's chest, in a way she could not have named. Wyatt came back and refilled her water without being asked. Then he set a plate of buttered toast beside it. "You don't have to eat it," he said. "Just had extra." He had not had extra, but that was not something either of them needed to discuss. Sophia stared at the toast for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, Can I stay here for a little while?" Wyatt looked at her then. Really looked. For the first time, the wet clothes, the guarded eyes, the posture of someone who had spent a long time being told to take up as little space as possible. "Yeah," he said. "Of course you can." The toast disappeared quickly, though she ate it in small, careful bites, as if she half expected someone to take it away mid-chew. Wyatt made her a bowl of soup without asking, and slid it across the counter. She looked at him briefly, looked back down. Then she ate the soup. He watched her the way he watched everything peripherally, with patience. Part of his mind was running the arithmetic of the situation, the same arithmetic any reasonable adult would be running. She was a minor, alone, no phone, no explanation of where she'd come from. The conventional response was to call the police or child services and let the proper systems handle it. He knew that. He was not naive about it, but he also knew what those systems sometimes looked like in practice. He had grown up in a small enough town to know which foster houses were good and which ones weren't, and he had spent enough time in waiting rooms and official offices to understand that the right thing on paper and the right outcome in reality did not always arrive at the same address. And he had spent the last 3 years raising Hannah with a precision born from the knowledge that, had someone been more careful, had someone paid attention on a wet road, one Tuesday afternoon. Had someone stopped instead of driving past, he would not be raising her alone at all. If there had been a stranger, someone who had paused, someone who had helped before the situation became permanent. He didn't say any of this out loud. "You warm enough?" he asked. Sophia nodded, though her shoulders were still shivering. He went to the back and retrieved the old gray pullover he kept, hanging beside the utility closet, a gas station purchase he'd never thrown out, and set it on the counter beside her without ceremony. She pulled it on immediately. Something in her expression loosened fractionally. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. "Sophia." "Okay, Sophia. I'm Wyatt." He didn't reach for a last name. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I need to know one thing." She looked up. "Are you in danger right now?" "Immediate danger?" The question seemed to catch her off balance. She actually thought about it, sat with it, which itself told him something, and then said, "Not right this second." "Okay." He nodded once. "You can stay." It was not a thoughtless decision, despite how it might have appeared. The back room behind the kitchen had a cot he slept on himself during the occasional long night when driving home wasn't worth the effort. It had a lock on the inside. It was private, and it was safe. He told her this plainly. He told her he would not bother her. He told her he would be at the front counter all night, that the door had a bell she would hear from the back, that in the morning they could figure out a next step together if she wanted one, and that if she didn't want that, she was free to leave and he would not stop her. Sophia listened to all of it, with her hands wrapped around the soup bowl. "Why would you do that?" she asked. It was a fair question. Wyatt considered it honestly. "Because you need somewhere to sleep, and I've got somewhere you can sleep," he said. "That's it." She studied him a moment longer, measuring something she didn't have words for. Then she slid off the stool and followed him to the back room, where she sat on the edge of the cot and looked at the floor. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and pulled the door shut behind him. Hannah woke at midnight, the way she sometimes did when something in the quiet had shifted. She climbed down from the corner booth, dragging her blanket, and padded into the kitchen in her socked feet, finding her father at the prep counter with a cup of coffee. "There's a girl in the back room," Wyatt said, before she could ask. Hannah absorbed this with the measured seriousness she applied to most things. "Is she sad?" "I think so," he said. "Okay." She went back to the booth and fell asleep again. By 3 a.m, the rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. Wyatt made a circuit of the empty diner, checking the door locks, topping off the salt shakers, doing the small maintenance that occupied his hands when his mind wouldn't settle. Through the wall he could hear nothing, but twice he had noticed the faint line of light under the backroom door go dark and return clicking off, and then on again, off, and then on again, as if she had tried to sleep and kept changing her mind. At 4:30, a truck pulled into the lot. Its headlights swept across the windows as it turned. The bell above the front door had not rung, but from the back room came a sharp sound, a sudden gasp, the scrape of furniture, the unmistakable noise of someone scrambling upright in alarm. The light under the door came on and stayed on. Wyatt knocked softly. "Just a truck. Customer coming in. You're fine." A silence. Then, "Okay." When Hannah reappeared at 7 with her worksheet and her stuffed rabbit and set up in her usual booth, she glanced at the backroom door with the deliberate casualness of a child who had already made a private decision. At some point while Wyatt was cracking eggs for a trucker at the counter, Hannah slipped from her booth, walked to the back room and knocked. Wyatt turned to intervene. But before he could, the door opened. Sophia stood in the doorway with the careful posture of someone who had not slept. She looked down at Hannah. Hannah looked up at her. Hannah held out the stuffed rabbit. For a moment, Sophia didn't move. Then she took it, holding it in both hands. And something crossed her face that Wyatt had not seen since she walked in through the rain. Something unguarded, undefended, the beginning of a smile. Fragile and completely real. "What's his name?" Sophia asked. "Carrot," Hannah said, as if this were obvious. "I'll take good care of him." "I know," Hannah said, and went back to her booth. Wyatt said nothing. He turned back to the grill. But later, When the trucker had gone and the diner had settled into its mid-morning quiet, Sophia sat at the counter with a cup of the coffee he'd put out and said something he had been turning over ever since. "They won't stop looking," she said. She was not speaking to him specifically. She was speaking to the counter, to the mug, to the particular problem of being seen by people who had decided they had the right to see you at all times. They'd never stop. That's the thing. They just never stop. Wyatt didn't push. He set a plate of pancakes in front of her and let the sentence sit where it had landed. The diner opened its proper morning shift at 6, and by 8, there were 4 regulars scattered across the booths, a retired highway inspector named Dale, a night shift nurse named Carol, who stopped in twice a week, and 2 farmers who sat at opposite ends of the counter and conducted their entire conversation at a volume meant for open fields. Hannah had refilled her own orange juice twice and was deep in the complicated logic of a word problem about fractions. It was almost normal. That was what made it so strange how close to normal it all felt. Sophia had eaten the pancakes, then a fried egg, then a piece of toast she had reached for herself without waiting to be offered, and Wyatt had noticed that and considered it a small but significant thing. Taking something without waiting for permission, even something as simple as a piece of toast, was its own kind of reclamation. Around 9, when the regulars had thinned and the morning noise softened, Sophia carried her empty plate to the pass-through window with the habitual ease of someone who had grown up around kitchens. Wyatt noticed this too. "You need to figure out your next step," he said, not unkindly. "I can help with that, if you want." Sophia leaned against the counter and looked out the window at the highway cars moving in both directions, each one a direction she could theoretically take. "My family has money," she said. "A lot of it. That's not nothing, but it doesn't mean what people think it means." Wyatt waited. "My mother runs everything. Everything." She said the word like it had sharp edges. "The house, the schedule, the school, the clothes, who I talk to, what I'm allowed to study. She calls it structure. She says it's because she loves me." A pause. "I used to believe that. What changed?" "I turned 15. She looked back at him. "She had this whole plan for my 16th birthday, a press release, an announcement about some junior board position at her company. She was going to have photos taken of me, in a suit, shaking hands with her board members. She didn't tell me first. She just told me what to wear." Wyatt kept his expression steady, though he felt something tighten in his chest. "I said no," Sophia continued. "That was the first time I had ever said no. She didn't yell. She's not a person who yells. She went very quiet and very still, and she explained to me that my feelings about it were not relevant data. The phrase, 'not relevant data,' landed between them like something cold and deliberate. That night I left," she said simply. Wyatt was about to respond. He had something forming. Not advice exactly, but a bridge. A practical question about whether there was anyone she trusted, an aunt, a school counselor, a friend's parent, something measured and useful and real. He never got to say it. The bell above the front door rang. Not the careful single tone of a customer stepping in from the parking lot. This was the full crash of the door thrown wide, the bell clanging hard and then cut off as the door struck the stop. 2 officers entered first, not rushing, but purposeful, moving the way people move when they carry authority and expect it to precede them. Both in uniform, hands loose at their sides, eyes already scanning the room before the door had finished settling. Behind them came a woman. She was dressed for an office meeting, not a search, a dark structured blazer, a bag carried at the elbow, heels that struck the tile floor with the particular rhythm of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever she entered. She was somewhere in her early 40s, composed in the way that people with considerable money learn to be composed, every expression placed with care. But her eyes, when they found Sophia at the counter, were not composed. They were the eyes of someone who had not been sleeping. Alexandra Blake stood inside the entrance of Carter's Diner at approximately 9:45 in the morning, found her daughter, and then found Wyatt, and what moved across her face in the space between those 2 moments was something Wyatt recognized immediately. It was not relief. It was not the uncomplicated joy of a mother reunited with a missing child. It was fury that had been repackaged as grievance, as accusation, as the settled certainty of a person who had decided what story she was telling before she ever walked through the door. "There she is," Alexandra said. The words were aimed at the officers, not at Sophia. The first officer, heavyset, gray at his temples, nameplate reading Hendricks, looked between Wyatt and Sophia, then at Sophia specifically. "You okay, miss?" Sophia said nothing. Alexandra was already moving. She crossed the diner floor with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the choreography of control. She placed herself between Sophia and the counter, her back partially to Wyatt, claiming the narrative geometry of the room before anyone could contest it. "She was taken from her home," Alexandra said, addressing the officers, "by this man." The word taken dropped into the room like something physical, like a stone into still water. Wyatt set down the dish towel he had been holding. He went very still. "Ma'am," the second officer began. "She is 15 years old, a minor. She has been here overnight." Alexandra's voice was modulated and unhurried, each sentence delivered with the care of someone who had thought about persuasion at length. "I want to know on what grounds he believed he had the right to keep my child from me." "Nobody kept anybody," Wyatt said. "Sir, I need you to step back," Hendricks said, though there was a question underneath his tone that Wyatt catalogued carefully. In the corner booth, Hannah had looked up from her fractions worksheet. She was perfectly still, watching her father with wide, very dark eyes. "She walked in here last night in the rain," Wyatt said, his voice level and unhurried, the voice of a man who had nothing to hide and understood that panic was the single least useful resource available to him. "She was soaking wet, alone, and didn't have anywhere to go. I gave her something to eat and a place to sleep safely. That is the entirety of what happened." Alexandra turned to face him fully for the first time. The expression of someone encountering an obstacle she had not expected to be this calm moved across her features. "He had no authority to make that decision," she said to the officers. "She is a minor. He is a stranger. Whatever he's telling you, he didn't do anything," Sophia said. The words were quiet, almost too quiet. But every person in the room heard them. Alexandra turned toward her daughter. The calibrated composure did not crack. It did something more subtle and more unsettling. It tightened. "Sophia," she said, in the voice that parents sometimes use and that children recognize instantly as the voice that precedes consequences, "you are not helping the situation." "He didn't do anything wrong," Sophia said, slightly louder this time. Hannah, in the corner booth, let out a small, involuntary breath. Then, in a voice too quiet for most of the room to catch but entirely audible to Wyatt, who heard everything that came from that particular booth, she said, "Daddy didn't do anything wrong." Officer Hendricks shifted his weight. Alexandra Blake was not a person who stumbled. She had been in rooms more hostile than this one, boardrooms, where adversaries had tried to take things from her. Negotiating tables where the opposing side had tried to rewrite terms she had already established. Situations where people had attempted to cast her as the villain and failed because she controlled the framing. She knew how to handle pressure. She knew specifically how to manage situations where she was outnumbered in emotion, but held the structural advantage of status and preparation. She pivoted. "I'm not here to argue," she told the officers, her register shifting softer now, slightly more measured, producing from somewhere in her bearing the quality of a worried mother rather than a furious executive. "I was out of my mind with worry all night. My daughter has had some struggles recently, emotional struggles, and when I learned she had spent the night with a stranger—" "She wasn't struggling," Wyatt said. "Sir." Hendricks held up a hand. "Let her finish," Alexandra continued. The story she constructed was smooth and internally consistent, the kind most dangerous, precisely because it used real details in service of a false overall shape. Yes, Sophia had been unhappy recently. Yes, there had been tension in the household, but the suggestion never stated outright, always implied through careful word selection, was that Wyatt had somehow encouraged the girl's presence, perhaps even welcomed a runaway in ways that a responsible adult would not. She did not use the word lured. She used the word allowed. She used it 6 times in 4 minutes. Wyatt watched Hendricks take notes. He watched the second officer, younger, quieter, nameplate reading Torres watching Sophia. He watched Alexandra's hands, still, positioned in front of her with the practiced openness of someone performing transparency. He was not afraid, but he understood, with complete clarity, the mechanism at work. Alexandra Blake was accustomed to controlling the version of events that other people walked away with, and at this moment, she was doing exactly that. "I need to ask you some questions," Hendricks said to Wyatt, stepping aside to create a separate conversation. "Of course," Wyatt said. He answered everything. He gave Hendricks the account in order, without embellishment or omission. What time Sophia had arrived, what she had been wearing, what she had asked for, what he had offered, where she had slept, that he had not touched her, had not pressed her for personal information beyond the single question about immediate danger, had not done anything he would not do for any person who walked through his door needing something. Hendricks wrote steadily. His face gave away nothing. Across the diner, Sophia sat on the counter stool, with Alexandra positioned close beside her, not quite touching, never quite touching, but occupying a proximity that communicated ownership without the formality of physical contact. Torres was speaking to Sophia in low tones. She was answering him, but Wyatt could see, even from across the room, what each answer was costing her. Her hands were pressed together in her lap. Her eyes kept moving briefly to her mother's profile. Each time they moved there, she appeared to pull something back, a sentence that had almost formed, retreating just before it became words. "She ran away," Wyatt said, not at Hendricks specifically, but audibly, clearly, into the room. "She came here on her own. She was frightened. I helped her." Alexandra turned toward him. "No one asked you to." "No," he said. "That's usually how it works, though." Hendricks looked up from his notepad briefly, then back down. From the corner booth, the small voice arrived definitive, carrying the particular authority of a 6-year-old who had decided something was wrong and had no mechanism for staying quiet about it. "My dad didn't do anything bad," Hannah said. She was standing now beside her booth, the fractions worksheet abandoned, the stuffed rabbit held in both arms. "He made her soup. He let her sleep. He didn't do anything bad." The room paused. Even Alexandra paused. There is something in the unedited certainty of a child's voice that can accomplish what adult argument rarely manages. It interrupts a narrative entirely, not through logic, but through the sheer, undeniable weight of something, said without calculation. Torres looked at Hannah, then at Wyatt, then at Alexandra, with an expression that had shifted, fractionally but perceptibly, from professional neutrality toward something less easy to categorize. Torres cleared his throat. "I think we should hear from Sophia," he said, without anyone else in the immediate area. Alexandra's expression went very still. The moment that followed was interesting in the way moments are when the balance of a room tips without anyone naming it out loud. Alexandra did not object to Torres's suggestion. She did not agree to it either. She did what a person accustomed to controlling situations does when they encounter a suggestion they don't like. She reframed the room by directing her attention back toward Hendricks and beginning a careful discussion about the precise legal parameters of custodial responsibility. Wyatt stepped back and let her talk. Torres was already guiding Sophia gently toward the far end of the counter, creating the informal privacy of a few additional feet. Sophia moved without resistance, and Wyatt noticed something in the way she walked that was different from the night before, less braced, as if the hours of sleep and the morning of food and the company of a 6-year-old with a rabbit named Carrot had done something small but structural to the way she was holding herself together. Hendricks produced a form from his jacket and set it on the counter in front of Wyatt. Given that the minor was here against what appears to be her guardian's knowledge, Hendricks said, "I need to ask you to sign a statement, acknowledging that you—" "I'm not signing anything," Wyatt said. Hendricks blinked. He had not expected that answer at that speed. "I understand what you're asking," Wyatt continued, his voice remaining at the same level register it had held since the moment Alexandra walked in. And I understand why the form exists. But I didn't hold that girl against her will. I didn't invite her here. She walked in from a rainstorm and asked if she could stay, and I said yes. That is what happened. If I sign something that implies otherwise, even by implication, I'm lying. And I'm not going to do that. Hendricks looked at him for a moment. You understand this could complicate things for you, he said. I understand that, Wyatt said. He meant it without performance. Since Julia had died, Wyatt Carter had not been afraid of complicated situations. He had recalibrated what frightening actually meant. What he remained afraid of, the one specific thing, was the idea of becoming the kind of person who let something wrong happen because staying quiet was easier. He had learned that lesson not from strength, but from absence, from the specific permanent shape of the intervention that had never come. Alexandra had paused her conversation with Hendricks and was watching Wyatt now with the careful expression of someone recalibrating their assessment. She was, beneath the controlled surface, surprised. In her considerable experience, men in positions of relative social vulnerability, small business owners, single parents, people without attorneys on retainer accommodated. They apologized. They signed things, and were grateful for the opportunity to sign things. This one was not apologizing. He was simply standing at his own counter in his own diner, looking at her with eyes that held no particular hostility, but no deference either. Just a kind of steady, unimpressed patience that she found, in a way she would not have acknowledged aloud, genuinely unnerving. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she said. I don't think so, he said. I think you're doing that. Hannah had resettled in her booth by then, though she was not working on her fractions. She was watching pencil in one hand, the edge of the blanket in the other, her expression identical to her father's, watchful, patient, entirely unimpressed by power that was not accompanied by rightness. From the far end of the counter, Sophia's voice rose slightly, not in distress, in something closer to the beginning of resolve. Torres had a different quality from his partner, quieter, more careful, the kind of officer who had been doing this long enough to know that the loudest voice in a room was rarely the most accurate one. He sat beside Sophia on the far stools with his notepad open but not prominently displayed, his body angled slightly away from her, which was a small but deliberate act of making space. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, he said. It was, remarkably, the same sentence Wyatt had used the night before. Sophia recognized the shape of it, and for a reason she couldn't have fully articulated, it loosened something in her chest. She started with what was easy. Her mother had always been demanding. That was not a secret. Alexandra Blake had been profiled in 7 business publications over the last decade, and every profile mentioned it. Her standards, her precision, her relentless expectation of excellence from everyone in her orbit. People called it drive. They called it vision. They used the word inspiring without irony. What those profiles never captured, because they were written by people who spoke to Alexandra and not to the people who lived inside Alexandra's orbit, was what it felt like to be managed rather than raised. Sophia tried to describe it to Torres. She described the schedule, not a loose family routine, but a literal schedule, printed and laminated and revised on a quarterly basis, governing her waking hours from 6 in the morning until 9 at night. She described the approved contact list, a document of people she was permitted to communicate with, reviewed and updated by Alexandra's personal assistant. She described the school presentations that Alexandra attended not to see Sophia perform, but to deliver corrections afterward. The inflection that had been wrong, the posture that had been weak, the answer that had been adequate, but not excellent. Torres wrote steadily. She described the phone a device equipped with a monitoring application so comprehensive that it logged not just calls and messages, but time spent in each application, websites visited, and words typed into search engines. She described realizing at 13 that a message she had sent to a close friend about feeling overwhelmed had appeared in a printed summary Alexandra had reviewed. She described the conversation that followed, calm, analytical, entirely without anger, in which Alexandra had explained that Sophia's communications reflected the family's public reputation and therefore required ongoing oversight. Did anyone outside the house know? Torres asked. People knew she was strict, Sophia said. Nobody knew what strict meant inside that house. The board announcement, the press release, the junior board position, the photographs in the suit had not been the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment the accumulated weight had become specific and impossible to carry into the next day. Lying in her bed, the night Alexandra told her what to wear, Sophia had understood something. There was no version of her future inside this system that contained anything she had chosen for herself. Every subsequent year had already been decided. Every appropriate feeling had already been assigned. She had not packed a bag. She had not planned. She had simply walked out. "She's not cruel," Sophia said, and she seemed to need to be precise about this, to locate the accurate word. "She doesn't hit me. She doesn't call me names. She's built a version of me that I'm supposed to inhabit, and there's no room inside it for the actual me." Torres looked up from his notepad. "That's a very precise way of putting it," he said. "I've had a long time to think about it," she said. At the other end of the diner, Alexandra was still talking to Hendricks, but the conversation had changed its shape. It was less directive now, more reactive. Wyatt could see this without hearing the words. He watched Hendricks ask something, watched Alexandra take a slightly longer pause than she had been taking before answering. Sophia looked down the length of the counter toward her mother. The distance between them was perhaps 30 feet. It felt, in that moment, like an accurate and honest measurement of something much larger and much older. "I was scared last night," Sophia said to Torres quietly. "But it was the first time, in a long time, that I wasn't scared of the person I was with. He didn't ask me anything. He just made soup and let me sleep." Torres nodded once. Then he closed his notepad. Not because the conversation was finished, but because what he had needed to hear, he had now heard. Torres walked back toward the center of the diner with the measured pace of a man who had reached a conclusion and was not in a hurry to announce it. He spoke briefly with Hendricks, a low exchange that Wyatt could not make out, and then Hendricks stopped writing on his form and recapped his pen. This was, Wyatt understood, a meaningful gesture. Alexandra was watching them. The expert composure had not left her face, but the architecture underlying it had shifted. She was reading the interaction the way she read all situations, scanning for leverage, for indicators of control, and what she was reading was not tracking in her favor. "I have a few follow-up questions," Torres said, addressing Alexandra directly for the first time. "My priority right now is getting my daughter home," Alexandra said. "I understand. These will take a few minutes." It was not framed as a request. Alexandra set her bag down on the counter, a controlled movement, a performance of cooperative calm, and waited. Torres asked about the monitoring application on Sophia's phone. He asked about the approved contact list. He asked about the quarterly schedule. He framed each question in the neutral, procedural register of a careful interviewer. No accusation, no leading, simply naming each thing and waiting for a response. With each question, Alexandra's answers became incrementally more defended. Not evasive, she was far too practiced for that, but they shifted from the confident assertions of the first 15 minutes toward the more careful territory of justification. The application was a standard parental tool. The contact list was a safety measure. The schedule reflected structure, and structure produced discipline, and discipline was what prepared a young person for the demands of the real world. "She's 15, Torres said quietly. "I'm aware of my daughter's age. Most 15-year-olds are allowed to call their friends." The room shifted. Hendricks had moved, almost imperceptibly, to a different position nearer the door, not blocking it, simply occupying a changed geometry. Alexandra's voice remained controlled, but it had thinned. The space between her carefully assembled sentences was getting shorter, and less space meant less room for calculation, and less calculation meant the occasional unguarded moment. One arrived. "She doesn't need friends," Alexandra said, and then, in the quality of Torres's silence, appeared to hear what she had just said out loud. "What she needs to be 15, Torres said. Not unkindly, not as a lecture, simply as a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet completeness of someone who no longer needed to soften it. Alexandra went silent. In that silence, Sophia slid off the counter stool and walked not toward her mother, not toward the door, but to Hannah's corner booth. She sat down across from Hannah with a kind of deliberate intention. Hannah slid the stuffed rabbit across the table toward her. You can keep him a little longer, Hannah said. Are you sure? He likes you, Hannah said. He told me. Sophia laughed. It was a sudden, unguarded sound, too quick to be managed, too real to be performed, and it moved through the quiet of the diner and landed somewhere it had not been before. Wyatt heard it from behind the counter. He turned away before anyone could see his face. Alexandra looked at her daughter laughing in a diner booth with a 6-year-old over a stuffed rabbit, and whatever she felt in that moment, whatever private reckoning arrived in the space between what she had built and what was actually sitting in front of her, she did not share. She picked up her bag. She spoke quietly to Hendricks. An arrangement was being reached. Not the arrangement she had arrived with, but an arrangement nonetheless. Wyatt did not involve himself in what came next. He went back behind the counter and put a fresh pot of coffee on, because whatever happened next, there were still people in his diner, and people in his diner got coffee. What came next unfolded over the following weeks, not in the diner but elsewhere in offices and in conversations that Wyatt was not part of and did not seek to be part of. Torres had filed a report. The report had been reviewed. Processes moved the way official things move slowly, uninspiringly, and on this occasion, correctly. Alexandra Blake remained a powerful woman. But power operates within systems, and systems, when given accurate information, do not always produce the outcomes that power expects. A family services caseworker visited the Blake residence. A school counselor was appointed. A formal conversation was held between Alexandra and a judge, the details of which Wyatt never learned. What he understood from the outcome was that a new arrangement had been reached, one that included, among other provisions, an independent advocate appointed to represent Sophia's interests going forward. Alexandra had not apologized to Wyatt. He had not expected her to. What she had done, and he learned this second-hand through Torres, who stopped in for coffee one Thursday morning 3 weeks later, was decline to pursue any formal complaint against him. The form that Hendricks had presented had been quietly set aside. Carter's Diner did not appear in any official record beyond the initial dispatch log, which noted only that a missing juvenile had been located at the premises and returned to appropriate care. Returned to appropriate care. The phrasing troubled him mildly. He hoped it meant something better than it might have meant. Sophia reached out to him once, through Torres, who passed along a message in the careful way of someone who understood the protocol around these situations. The message was short. It read, "Thank you for the soup." Wyatt read it and laughed, a short, quiet, surprised sound he hadn't entirely been expecting, and then folded the note and placed it in the drawer beneath the register where he kept the things he wanted to keep. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks after all of it, Hannah sat in the corner booth with a new worksheet and a proprietary comfort in the diner that had, if anything, deepened in the aftermath of what had happened. She was working through a problem about distances, how far a car would travel in 2 hours at a certain speed, when she looked up at her father, who was cleaning the espresso machine with the focused care he gave to all maintenance. "Dad," she said, "do you wish you hadn't let her stay?" Wyatt set down the cleaning cloth. He thought about it the way he thought about everything that actually mattered thoroughly, without rushing, without flattening the question into something simpler than it was. He thought about the 2 officers walking in, about Alexandra's voice using the word taken, about the form he hadn't signed, about Torres's expression when he had closed his notepad. He thought about the laugh, Sophia's laugh, the one that had contained no calculation in it at all. "No," he said, "I don't." Hannah considered this. "Even though it was scary?" "Especially because it was scary," he said. "The things that are right are sometimes the same things that are hard. That's not a sign you shouldn't do them. It's just the cost of doing them." Hannah stayed with this for a while, the way she stayed with the harder problems, not rushing toward an answer, but remaining in the difficulty until the shape of it became visible. "Okay," she said eventually, and went back to her worksheet. Wyatt picked up the cleaning cloth and returned to the espresso machine. Outside, a car turned into the lot. The bell above the door had not yet rung, but it would, and when it did, he would be ready. He was always ready. That was the particular nature of running a place that never closed. It required a willingness to be present for whatever walked in, on whatever night, in whatever condition. He had not built Carter's Diner for its symbolic value. He had simply built a place that stayed open, because staying open was the thing he knew how to do. And sometimes when the rain came in cold and sideways, and a frightened girl found the lights still on at the end of a dark road, that turned out to be exactly enough. Kindness is not always safe. It does not always resolve cleanly. It does not guarantee that the person who receives it will be grateful, or that the system surrounding it will respond with fairness, or that you will emerge from it unscathed. Wyatt Carter knew all of that, and had made his choice anyway, not because he was certain of the outcome, but because a man who had already lost the thing he could not afford to lose had a very clear understanding of what things were actually worth protecting. He had not protected himself that night. He had protected something quieter and harder to name, the simple rightness of an open door when someone needed one. A father protects his child. That much is given, instinctive, written into the architecture of love before love becomes anything as complicated as a decision. But a person, a real person, the kind whose choices mean something, sometimes protect something beyond their own household. Sometimes they stand at the boundary of what is easy and what is correct, and they plant their feet on the correct side and they do not move. That was what Wyatt Carter had done. Not heroically, not without cost, simply without apology. Outside, the car in the lot cut its engine. A door opened. Footsteps crossed the gravel. The bell above the diner door rang, clean and clear as it always did, and Wyatt Carter looked up, the way he always looked up, and was ready.